The office always carried a strange stillness before most people arrived, and Helena had grown to appreciate that hour when fluorescent lights hummed softly and the smell of freshly made coffee drifted through the empty corridors. It was the only moment of the day when she felt the building wasn't asking anything of her. Later, when screens lit up and voices multiplied, she would become the quiet pillar everyone unconsciously leaned on. In those early minutes, however, she moved slowly, as if observing a world that had not yet awakened. Her desk reflected a life built on discipline and constancy. Everything had a precise place, folders aligned, pens arranged, notes updated from the night before. She never intended to leave an impression, she simply worked. Yet the office treated her efficiency as something invisible, like a reliable machine humming in the background. People recognized her only in moments of crisis, when they whispered her name as if calling for a mechanic to repair whatever had gone wrong. She rarely complained. Her identity had been shaped by years of quiet maintenance, of holding together projects that carried other people's signatures. As she sat down, the screens flickered to life, bathing her face in a pale glow that made her feel older than the mirror at home ever did. The office was filled with younger professionals. Sharp clothes, bright laughter, and a constant rhythm of ambition. They belonged to a world fueled by speed and novelty, while she occupied a steadier, quieter track. She did not resent them. She simply did not expect to belong in the same current. She carried the weight of years spent proving her worth, even when no one asked for proof. Her morning routine unfolded with familiar predictability, checking messages, reviewing yesterday's reports, preparing materials for yet another meeting in which her contributions would be summarized by someone else. The rhythm was so ingrained that she barely noticed how deeply it shaped her, how it pressed her into the background in ways she never questioned. But today, something unsettled her. As she passed by a glass partition, she caught a glimpse of herself, hair tied neatly, posture straight, expression composed. Nothing unusual. And yet the reflection stirred a faint unease, as if she were looking at a version of herself she had grown into without noticing. The lines near her eyes, the calm endurance in her gaze, the quiet acceptance etched into her features. She looked like someone who had spent too long being necessary, but never celebrated. The office began filling with footsteps and conversations. People greeted her politely but quickly, as if she were part of the infrastructure, reliable but unremarkable. She answered every greeting with the same gentle nod. Her value lay in efficiency, not presence, and she had grown comfortable with that. Or at least she believed she had. Work flowed in. A colleague dropped a stack of files on her desk with hurried gratitude. Another asked for help correcting a mistake that threatened to derail a presentation. Helena handled everything with precision, hiding the exhaustion that clung to her shoulders. She moved through it all with the grace of someone who no longer expected acknowledgement, someone who knew that her contributions would dissolve into the fabric of the office without leaving a trace. By mid-morning, the place felt like a hive. Phones ringing, keyboards clattering, voices rising in overlapping waves. Helena navigated it with ease, silently stitching together loose ends. People's successes often depended on her unseen labor, but they rarely noticed. They praised each other loudly, celebrated achievements publicly, and moved in circles where visibility mattered more than substance. She watched them from a distance, a spectator hidden in plain sight. Still, beneath her composed exterior, a subtle heaviness tightened her chest. She wondered when she had stopped expecting anything different. When had she accepted invisibility as part of her identity? When had she begun believing that aging in the workplace meant slowly dissolving into the walls? The day continued in a blur of tasks, meetings, and decisions made by people who never looked in her direction long enough to see her expression. At times, she felt like a ghost drifting between desks, present but unnoticed. At other moments, she felt strangely proud of her resilience, of her ability to remain steady when everything around her seemed fueled by instability. Yet something inside her shifted, quietly, almost imperceptibly. Maybe it was the reflection she had seen earlier. Maybe it was the realization that she had shaped her entire professional life around being dependable, not visible. She wondered if there was still room in her story for change, or if the years had carved her path too deeply. But she did not allow the thought to linger. There was always another task waiting, another request, another silence she had learned to fill without complaint. She returned to her work, steady as always, unaware that the arrival of someone new, someone whose presence she could not yet imagine, would soon turn the office into a mirror that reflected far more than her routine. She did not know that the world she had accepted for so long was about to shift. She did not know that her quiet invisibility was on the verge of being interrupted. All she knew, in that moment, was the familiar rhythm of her own endurance. The news of a new analyst joining the team spread through the office in the usual way. Casual remarks, fragmented whispers, assumptions built from nothing. Helena paid little attention. Newcomers arrived often, most of them young, eager, and indistinguishable from the rest. They carried ambition like a badge and blended into the company's constant churn. She expected nothing different from this one. But when she stepped into the corridor that morning, she saw him before she heard anyone mention his name. Lucas. Tall, composed, carrying himself with a calmness that contrasted sharply with the nervous energy so typical of first days. Instead of the restless enthusiasm she often saw in new employees, there was an attentive stillness in him, as if he observed the world before deciding where he belonged within it. Helena approached with her habitual professionalism, prepared to introduce herself and move on with her tasks. But when he turned toward her, something in his expression caught her off guard. His eyes held a quiet respect, not the rushed courtesy people usually offered. He looked at her as if her presence mattered, as if he understood who she was before she said a word. She guided him through the initial procedures, walking him from department to department, reviewing protocols, showing him where everything was stored. The corridors echoed with the soft hum of printers, the muted ringing of phones, and the distant murmur of conversations. As they walked, she noticed how he listened, not only to her words, but to the rhythm of the place, as if mapping its temperament. When they reached her workstation, she showed him the files he would need to review, the spreadsheets he would eventually handle, and the systems he would learn to navigate. He leaned forward with genuine interest, asking for nothing, interrupting nothing. His gratitude was quiet, sincere, unperformed. Something unfamiliar stirred inside her. It had been years since anyone had looked at her work with that kind of acknowledgement. She was used to reactions ranging from indifference to hurried appreciation delivered without eye contact. Lucas, however, examined every detail she explained with thoughtful attention, as if the structure she maintained was not merely functional, but admirable. Throughout the morning, small gestures accumulated like soft footprints. The way he stood slightly angled toward her when she spoke. The way he repeated certain instructions softly to ensure he understood them. The way he offered to carry a stack of files when he noticed her arms full. None of it was intrusive. It felt considerate. When they headed to the break area, colleagues watched from a distance, already forming silent evaluations. But Helena remained unaware of their interest. She was too focused on the unfamiliar warmth creeping into her chest. Being seen was disorienting in ways she had forgotten how to process. Lucas picked up his coffee and thanked her again, this time with a nod that held something deeper than politeness. She sensed an emotional maturity in him that did not align with his age. He did not rush, did not boast, did not display the competitive edge that dominated so much of the office culture. Instead, he moved through the space as though grounded in something steady. As they returned to their desks, she felt the subtle shift in the atmosphere, an awareness she could not quite name. The office, with all its routines and hierarchies, seemed to pay attention to them. She brushed off the thought. He was new. She was responsible for guiding him. There was nothing more to it. But later, when she caught him observing her across the room, his gaze calm, unassuming, almost grateful, she felt a flicker of something she had not felt in years. It wasn't attraction, nor discomfort. It was recognition, as if he saw a part of her that everyone else had long stopped noticing. She tried to shake off the feeling, returning her focus to her reports. Yet his presence lingered in the periphery of her awareness, like a quiet reminder of a world she had forgotten how to inhabit. A world where someone might look at her not as a function, but as a person. She did not know that this was only the beginning, that the gentle way he observed her would become something others would scrutinize, that their simple, respectful connection would transform into the spark that illuminated everything around them, for better and for worse. For now, it was just a moment in the corridor, a moment where, after years of being unseen, she felt the faintest shift in the air, an acknowledgement that would ripple far beyond anything she imagined. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm neither of them had planned, yet both seemed to step into effortlessly. The office, with its predictable cycles of tasks and deadlines, slowly shifted its atmosphere whenever Helena and Lucas shared the same space. Their interactions were subtle. Quiet conversations while waiting for the printer, shared smiles over small mistakes in spreadsheets, silent acknowledgments of each other's presence during long afternoons of concentrated work. Nothing dramatic, nothing out of line. But there was a softness in the way they communicated, a gentleness that stood out in a place ruled by urgency and competition. It didn't take long for others to notice. The susurros began almost invisibly, woven between the clicking of keyboards and the low hum of air conditioning. Colleagues who had never paid attention to Helena now looked up when she walked by, their eyes flicking toward Lucas as if she carried a clue they were trying to decipher. She sensed it first in the sudden quiet that fell whenever she entered a room. Then came the glances, some curious, others amused, and a few edged with something darker, like suspicion disguised as interest. Helena tried to dismiss it. She had survived decades of corporate dynamics and believed she had grown immune to speculation. But this felt different. It wasn't about her work anymore. It was about her existence. People watched the space she occupied, the path she walked, the pauses in her sentences. She could almost hear their thoughts, shaped by cliches and assumptions they built around her age and Lucas's youth. Still, she carried on with her tasks, refusing to let the whispers sink their hooks too deeply. Yet something within her tightened whenever she heard laughter behind her, laughter that ended too abruptly when she turned. It reminded her of old wounds she thought she had already sealed, times when she had been judged for choices she never made, times when silence had been used as a shield, not protection. Lucas, meanwhile, seemed unaware of the growing murmurs. Or perhaps he simply chose not to feed them. He worked with steady focus, leaning over reports, offering help when needed, respecting boundaries Helena never had to articulate. He brought a sense of calm that softened the abrasive edges of their days. When he asked if she had eaten lunch or if she needed help with a file too large to organize alone, there was no performance in his tone, only sincerity. Yet sincerity was not a language the office understood well. One afternoon, as they reviewed a complicated financial projection together, she caught a glimpse of two colleagues exchanging looks behind them. It wasn't subtle. Their expressions shifted from amusement to exaggerated surprise, as if Helena and Lucas discussing data was somehow scandalous. A heat rose in her cheeks, part embarrassment, part anger. She stepped back slightly, creating a distance that hurt more than she expected. Lucas noticed the shift immediately. He glanced at her, confusion shadowing his expression, but she avoided his eyes, pretending to focus on the numbers glowing on the screen. She feared what he might read in her gaze, fear, self-consciousness, perhaps a hint of shame she wished she didn't feel. She hated the possibility that he might interpret her discomfort as rejection, when in truth it was the weight of other people's judgments pressing against her ribs. The next morning, the tension in the air felt thicker. Conversations halted when she passed by the coffee machine. A message thread closed abruptly on a coworker's screen when she approached to ask for a file. Her name, she realized, had slipped into people's private commentaries, and attached to it, inevitably, was Lucas's. She wondered what they said. She imagined the words they used, the simplifications they made. She imagined their curiosity, their smirks, their theories about why a younger man might gravitate toward her quiet presence. Each imagined scenario cut deeper than the last. But beneath her discomfort, there was something gentler trying to form, an awareness of how natural her connection with Lucas had felt. None of their shared moments had been inappropriate or intentional. They were simply two people who found ease in each other's company. Yet the world around them insisted on turning simplicity into spectacle. Despite everything, Helena found herself drawn to Lucas's steadiness. His presence made the noise of the office, literal and emotional, easier to bear. And though she tried to disguise it, he sensed her retreating. He watched her with a quiet concern, choosing not to confront her directly, but offering small gestures that communicated more than words ever could. Leaving a report neatly organized on her desk, sending a brief message thanking her for guidance, slowing his pace to match hers when they walked in the corridor. It wasn't romance. It wasn't infatuation. It was recognition. Two people seeing in each other something the world around them refused to acknowledge. But recognition, too, can be misinterpreted. As the whispers grew louder, Helena's certainty began to crack. She questioned whether she had invited the attention, whether she had failed to maintain enough distance. She questioned her own worth, her appearance, her place in the narrative that others were crafting without her consent. And beneath all her doubts, a single fear took root, that the gentle connection forming between her and Lucas might drown beneath the weight of other people's eyes. The shift truly began when the company secured the major project that would define the quarter, an undertaking so large and complex that it demanded every ounce of attention from the team. The announcement arrived with a flurry of excitement, and suddenly the office buzzed with a new urgency. Deadlines tightened, meetings multiplied, and even the more complacent employees straightened their posture as if preparing for a marathon. Helena had seen cycles like this before. She knew the silent sacrifices this kind of project required. The late nights, the forgotten lunches, the emotional exhaustion disguised as dedication. She braced herself without complaint, already adjusting her schedule to absorb the weight others would inevitably transfer to her. When the assignments were distributed, her name appeared beside Lucas's, paired as co-responsives for a critical analytical segment. The decision surprised her. Pairings were rarely made across such a stark difference in experience, but leadership claimed it was strategic, her mastery combined with his fresh perspective. She sensed other motives beneath the explanation, but chose not to linger on them. From the first day they worked together, the rhythm between them settled naturally. Helena's precision met Lucas's adaptability. Her knowledge guided his questions, and his calm focus eased the tension she often carried alone. They stayed in the office long after others left, surrounded by scattered notes, glowing screens, and half-empty coffee cups that marked the passage of time more reliably than clocks. Some nights, the building transformed into a world of its own. Dim hallways, the distant whir of machines, their soft conversations echoing between cubicles. Helena found herself unexpectedly comfortable in those spaces. The sterile corporate environment became warmer, almost intimate, not because of romance but because collaboration, when genuine, holds a quiet beauty few people recognize. Yet others did not see beauty. They saw opportunity. Colleagues began noticing how often Helena and Lucas remained after hours. Some framed it as dedication, others labeled it as unusual. One person joked loudly about mentoring turning into something else, and though the comment wasn't directed at them, Helena felt it sting like a slap. She had no desire to be part of the company's rumor economy, yet she was being pulled into it regardless. Still, the work demanded focus. Numbers piled up, inconsistencies surfaced, and their portion of the project required meticulous coordination. Lucas often deferred to her expertise, but he was not passive. He analyzed patterns with impressive clarity, posed questions that pushed their work forward, and stayed patient even when the system crashed or data refused to load. His attitude reminded Helena of what collaboration was supposed to feel like: supportive, balanced, and free of hidden agendas. One late evening, as they compared two conflicting data sets, Lucas leaned closer to the screen, scanning the rows with concentration. Helena watched him briefly, not with affection, but with admiration for the seriousness he brought to the task. He embodied a maturity she did not expect from someone his age, a steadiness that mirrored qualities she had cultivated over decades. But admiration, too, could be misinterpreted. The following morning, she overheard two managers discussing the project. One praised Lucas's potential, while the other dismissed her contributions with a casual remark about her being experienced enough to handle the background work. She felt the familiar ache of invisibility tightening in her chest. Her role, once again, had been reduced to function rather than recognition. Lucas, however, seemed attuned to the imbalance. During a progress meeting, when a suggestion she made was brushed aside, he subtly echoed her point, amplifying it until the room acknowledged it. It was a small gesture, quiet, respectful, but it pierced through the fog of disregard that often surrounded her. She thanked him only with a faint nod. Anything more might draw more attention. As pressure increased, so did the scrutiny. People who rarely interacted with Helena began approaching her with feigned curiosity, asking how the project was progressing, slipping Lucas's name into conversations with pointed casualness. She responded politely, refusing to feed speculation, but the tension in her shoulders grew heavier each day. Yet despite the noise, their work flourished. They completed tasks ahead of schedule, identified errors others had missed, and created a structure so efficient that supervisors praised the team without understanding who deserved credit. The project forced Helena into continual proximity with Lucas, and though she tried to remain reserved, a quiet comfort formed between them, a steady rhythm in the midst of chaos. That comfort, however, became a spotlight neither of them had asked for. People began watching their interactions with a curiosity that bordered on intrusive. Even the simplest gesture, a shared spreadsheet, a brief conversation, was enough to ignite more commentary. Helena felt the office closing in, turning everyday moments into observations. But the spotlight did more than illuminate their presence. It exaggerated every detail until small truths became distorted. Their collaboration no longer belonged solely to the work. It had become a narrative others felt entitled to shape. And Helena, who had spent decades building a life of quiet competence, sensed that something irreversible had begun. The project did not merely demand excellence. It had awakened a scrutiny that would soon test both her dignity and her resilience. The meeting room was colder than usual, the kind of artificial chill that seeped into people's posture and made even confident voices sound sharper. Rows of chairs filled quickly as managers from multiple departments arrived, each carrying a laptop, a notebook, or simply an air of self-importance. This was the presentation that would define the quarter, the moment the leadership would evaluate everyone's contribution to the massive project underway. Helena sat 3 seats from the front, as she always did, close enough to follow the discussion, far enough to remain unseen. Lucas sat beside her, reviewing the final numbers on a tablet. He didn't fidget. He didn't shift nervously. His calm presence was like a small anchor in a room filled with restless waves. Helena felt a brief, unexpected comfort in knowing he was there, though she reminded herself to maintain the professional distance she had been guarding. The meeting began with predictable theatrics, gratitude expressed too quickly, praise distributed too broadly, achievements summarized in vague terms that favored visibility over substance. Helena watched as names were mentioned in rehearsed sequences, each one receiving nods and satisfied murmurs. She recognized the choreography. She had seen it play out countless times, and as always, her name did not appear. Instead, the director highlighted the dynamic energy of the younger analysts who had contributed to the project. He gestured proudly toward a pair of employees who had, in truth, barely touched the core of the work. They smiled with the confidence of people accustomed to being celebrated for presence rather than effort. The director continued, acknowledging individuals whose contributions were peripheral at best, creating a narrative that erased the long nights Helena and Lucas had spent bringing order to chaos. Helena felt the familiar burn behind her ribs, a quiet disappointment she had learned to swallow. She lowered her gaze, trying to make peace with being overlooked once again. This was the pattern of her professional life. She carried weight, others carried credit. But before she could settle into resignation, Lucas shifted beside her. She sensed it before she saw it. The subtle tightening of his posture, the way his breath drew in sharply as if preparing for something. He straightened in his chair, just as the director moved on to the next topic. Then Lucas spoke. His voice cut through the room with a clarity that startled everyone. including Helena. "Before we move forward," he said, "we should acknowledge the person who made the most important contributions to this project." The room fell silent, as if the air itself froze. All eyes turned toward him. Helena's heart dropped. She wanted to stop him, to urge caution, to disappear. But his expression was firm, respectful, and unshaken by the attention. He continued, his tone steady. "Most of the solutions we implemented came from Helena's experience and analytical rigor. She identified crucial discrepancies, built the structural framework for the data, and guided the entire direction of our segment." The director blinked, caught off guard. A few managers exchanged uncomfortable looks. Someone coughed. Helena felt heat rising to her face. Not embarrassment from the praise itself, but from the sudden rupture in the unspoken rules of the room. Lucas pressed on. "I learned more from working with her over the last few weeks than I could have imagined. And this project wouldn't be what it is without her." He didn't exaggerate. He didn't dramatize. He stated the truth, plainly and without apology. But truth can be the most disruptive force in a place built on politics. Whispers surged across the room like a tide. Some looked impressed. Others looked annoyed, even offended. The director offered a tight smile, forced and brittle. "Yes, of course," he said stiffly. "Helena has been a valued member of the team for a long time." It was a dismissal disguised as acknowledgement. Helena felt it like a blade. Lucas wasn't done. "With all respect, sir," he added gently, "I believe it's important to give credit accurately, especially when the work speaks so clearly." His words carried no anger, only conviction. But conviction, when spoken aloud in a place that rewards compliance, becomes a provocation. Helena's chest tightened. She felt exposed under the collective gaze. A woman who had never sought the spotlight suddenly thrown onto a stage she did not choose. She could sense the shift in the room, the recalculation of assumptions. Some saw Lucas as admirable. Others saw him as naive or inappropriate. Many saw her as something else entirely, an anomaly, a complication to analyze. She wanted to disappear. And yet, beneath the embarrassment, something deeper stirred. A tremor of validation she had not felt in years. Someone had seen her. Someone had refused to let her be erased. But the meeting ended with awkward tension, leaving behind a residue of unresolved emotions. People filed out quickly, whispering. Lucas remained seated, waiting until the room emptied before turning to her. She didn't speak. She couldn't. Her hands trembled slightly, though she tried to hide it. He simply nodded, as if saying, "I meant every word." And for the first time in a very long time, Helena felt the tremor of a truth she had forgotten belonged to her. Being seen was both terrifying and extraordinary. The aftermath arrived faster than Helena expected. By the time she reached her desk after the meeting, her inbox already carried subtle ripples of what had happened. Messages with ambiguous subject lines, vague requests for updates, notes from colleagues who had never contacted her directly before. The office had always been quick to transform information into commentary, but this time the speed felt sharp, almost predatory. She sat down quietly, willing herself to breathe normally. Her hands still held a faint tremor from the moment Lucas had spoken her name in that room. She replayed it in fragments, the confidence in his tone, the unwavering clarity, the way he refused to let her disappear. For a brief moment, the memory felt warm. But the warmth evaporated as soon as she noticed two coworkers whispering near the entrance, casting glances in her direction. That was how it began. What should have been a genuine acknowledgement of her effort quickly mutated into something else. Praise, in that environment, became fuel for speculation. Instead of celebrating her contributions, people began questioning motives. They dissected Lucas's gesture with precision, far greater than they ever applied to their actual work. At first, the comments were subtle. "Interesting how he defended her so passionately. Didn't know they were that close. He must really admire her, in some way." The tone carried a casual cruelty, soft enough to appear harmless, sharp enough to wound. Helena felt each remark like a pressure against her ribs. She had lived long enough in that company to know that stories formed quickly, and once they formed, they grew roots. Throughout the morning, she sensed the narrative spreading. Someone passed by her desk and smiled with excessive politeness, the kind used when someone pretends not to know something they absolutely know. Another colleague asked Lucas a question he could have easily answered alone, as if trying to measure his reaction, to see whether his voice changed when Helena's name was mentioned. Lucas responded with the same steady professionalism as always. If he noticed the undercurrents, he didn't show it. He moved through the office with quiet dignity, acknowledging Helena's presence with a small nod, but nothing that could feed rumors further. He seemed determined to protect the integrity of the moment he had created, but intention was no match for gossip. By lunch, the whispers had shifted tone. Admiration had morphed into insinuations. Why would someone so young make a scene like that for her? There must be something going on. He's new. Maybe he thinks she can help him climb. No. It's the opposite, don't you see? She's investing in him. Helena almost dropped her fork when she overheard that last one in the cafeteria line. Investing. As if she were a bargaining chip. As if her decades of work could be reduced to a rumor built in the span of a morning. She returned to her desk early, seeking refuge in spreadsheets and reports, desperate to bury herself in something factual. Numbers did not whisper. Cells did not assume. Formulas did not distort intentions. But even at her workstation, she couldn't escape the feeling of eyes lingering too long, of footsteps slowing when passing behind her. Every notification sound startled her. Every email felt like a potential judgment disguised as a request. The worst part was not what they said about her. The worst part was what they said about Lucas. She heard a group of employees near the break room discussing him with patronizing amusement. "He's idealistic," one said. "Doesn't understand how things work here." Another added, "Probably thinks he's saving her." Cute. They spoke as though sincerity were a flaw, as though integrity were a foreign language. She wanted to defend him, but she stayed silent, torn between protecting him and protecting herself. Later, as she gathered some documents from the printer, she sensed a hush behind her. Two coworkers were staring at her with expressions that blended pity and curiosity. Before she could turn away, one muttered softly, "For her age, she should know better." The word struck her like a blow she hadn't braced for. For her age, as if kindness had an expiration date, as if dignity could be diminished by years lived, as if being seen, truly seen, was something she no longer deserved. She returned to her desk with a tightness in her throat she struggled to swallow. The validation she had briefly felt earlier now twisted into a weight she couldn't shake. The office, once just a place of work, had become a mirror reflecting not just her insecurities, but everyone else's assumptions. By late afternoon, Lucas approached her desk. Not too close, not too abruptly, just enough for her to sense him standing there. "Let me know if you need anything," he said quietly. His voice carried no hidden meaning, only the same steady respect that had always defined his interactions with her. She nodded without meeting his eyes, afraid that any visible warmth might be misinterpreted, twisted, or weaponized. The praise he had offered her was sincere. But in the hands of the office, sincerity had become accusation, admiration had become scandal, respect had become rumor. And Helena, caught in the center of a storm she never invited, realized with painful clarity, sometimes being defended was more dangerous than being ignored. Helena left the office building that evening with the weight of the day pressing so heavily against her chest that breathing felt like a conscious effort. The city outside buzzed with its usual noises, cars passing, distant conversations, the faint hum of life continuing without hesitation. Yet inside her, everything felt muted. The meeting, the whispers, the glances. Each moment replayed itself like a loop she couldn't escape. When she reached her apartment, the familiar quiet wrapped around her like an old, worn blanket. The space reflected the life she had built alone, organized, calm, predictable. She placed her keys on the counter, removed her shoes with deliberate slowness, and stood in the middle of the living room, unsure of what to do next. Normally, she would begin preparing dinner or sort through documents she brought home. But that night, she could barely lift her arms. Instead, she sat on the couch, elbows on her knees, fingers pressed against her forehead. Shame pulsed through her, not because of anything she had done, but because of the narrative others had created around her. She felt exposed, as if the entire office had peered into a private corner of her life and interpreted shadows as truth. The humiliation burned quietly, the kind that didn't need words to sting. Yet beneath the shame, something else flickered. Pride. She tried to push it away, but it lingered stubbornly. Lucas had spoken up for her in a room where silence was the safest currency. He had risked more than he understood, broken unspoken rules, and challenged a hierarchy that preferred her invisible. He had done it with sincerity, not spectacle. She whispered into the empty room. Why did he do that? The question floated unanswered, dissolving into the still air. Her phone buzzed with a message from an old friend. A simple check-in with no connection to work. Helena ignored it, not ready to navigate small talk. She closed her eyes instead, letting memories rise from the back of her mind. She remembered younger days when she had been bold, quick to defend others, unafraid of judgment. But years of being overlooked had taught her caution, had shaped her into someone who chose silence to avoid trouble. Lucas's gesture had disrupted that silence, and now she didn't know how to exist between the humiliation and the unexpected pride. The next morning, walking into the office felt like walking onto a stage she never auditioned for. Conversations dimmed as she passed. People stared with the unfiltered curiosity of those who enjoyed drama more than truth. She kept her eyes fixed forward, her steps measured. Her skin felt too thin for the environment. Lucas arrived a few minutes after her. He offered a small nod. Nothing excessive, nothing noticeable to others, but she felt it like a quiet lifeline. She returned the gesture with a fraction of a smile before lowering her gaze again. Throughout the day, she sensed him watching her subtly, not out of concern for himself but concern for her. He moved through the workflow as usual, but whenever she faltered slightly or hesitated before speaking in a meeting, he used his presence to strengthen the moment, rephrasing a point she made, securing space for her ideas, creating balance without drawing attention. It was a strange, delicate dance, one that comforted her even as it terrified her. During lunch, she sat alone by choice. She heard footsteps approaching and felt a brief panic, but it was only Lucas passing by on his way to the kitchen. He didn't stop or try to sit with her, respecting the boundaries she had built out of self-preservation. Yet, when he reached the end of the hallway, he glanced back. The look was brief, almost imperceptible, but it reached her. Later in the afternoon, Helena retrieved a file from the storage room. The quiet there was different, less judgmental, more neutral. She let the stillness soothe her, but when she stepped back into the corridor, two co-workers suddenly fell silent mid-conversation. One of them forced a smile, overly sweet, and the other avoided eye contact. Their reaction told her everything. By the time she returned to her desk, the humiliation had returned with full force. She wondered if Lucas regretted speaking up. She wondered if his career would be affected by the assumptions people made about them. She wondered if she had become a burden to him without meaning to. But that evening, as they packed up to leave, Lucas paused beside her desk. He spoke softly, just loud enough for her to hear. "You shouldn't carry this alone." The words were simple, but they reached into the very place where humiliation had rooted itself. He wasn't dismissing her feelings or telling her to be strong. He was acknowledging the storm she was navigating. She didn't respond. She couldn't trust her voice not to tremble. He didn't expect an answer. He simply walked toward the elevator, his footsteps steady, patient, as if offering her time to breathe. As Helena followed moments later, she realized that the day had given her something unexpected. Not resolution, not clarity, but a fragile thread between humiliation and pride. An understanding that someone stood with her in the quiet spaces where judgment echoed loudest. And though she was still afraid, she felt less alone. The days that followed unfolded with a heaviness Helena tried to mask behind routine. She had spent years being steady, composed, and dependable, and she continued to move through the office with that same restraint even as her chest tightened more each morning. Silence became her armor, thin, fragile, but reliable in its own way. If she spoke less, people noticed less. If she kept distance, rumors had fewer chances to grow teeth. Her first step was physical distance. She arrived earlier than usual, slipping into the building before the hallways swelled with voices. She stopped making small comments to Lucas while reviewing spreadsheets, avoided the lunchroom altogether, and chose routes through the office that kept her away from unnecessary interactions. She convinced herself that she was protecting both of them by stepping back. Lucas noticed the shift immediately. He respected boundaries, but his awareness was sharp. He no longer approached her desk unless absolutely necessary. And even then, he kept his tone neutral, his posture careful, as though resisting the urge to close a distance she had constructed. He never confronted her. He simply adjusted, quietly, patiently, matching the space she created. That patience made the distance feel even more painful. Helena spent much of her time in the storage room, sorting files under the guise of reorganizing archives. In truth, she sought refuge among shelves and dust, where the only voices were those in her own thoughts. There, she let herself feel the ache she hid from the world, the confusion, the longing for dignity, the gratitude she feared turning into dependency. She told herself she was being sensible. She reminded herself of her age, her history, the consequences of being misinterpreted. But reasoning did nothing to soften the loneliness she had invited in. In the office, the atmosphere shifted. Rumors lost their initial sharpness, replaced by a quieter curiosity. People found new subjects to discuss, and the intensity of attention gradually faded. Even so, the remnants lingered. Small glances, faint pauses, the kind of subtle observations that felt like dust settling slowly after a storm. Yet in that fading noise, Helena felt no relief. Instead, her silence created a different kind of weight. She missed the ease she had shared with Lucas, the natural flow of their collaboration, the quiet comfort of knowing someone saw her, not as background, but as a person with presence, value, and voice. Still, she kept her distance. One afternoon, while reviewing a document in the meeting room, she sensed Lucas enter quietly. He placed a stack of organized reports on the table near her, ready for their final review. Their hands brushed accidentally, a fleeting contact that sent a subtle jolt through her. She withdrew instinctively, murmuring a soft, "Thank you," that barely rose above a whisper. Lucas hesitated for a moment before responding. "If you need more time with the projections, I can handle the other section." His voice was calm, almost too calm, as if concealing something gentler beneath its surface. "I'm fine," she replied. Too quickly, too abruptly. He studied her with a restrained expression. Not hurt, not frustrated, but quietly concerned. He offered a small nod and stepped back, giving her more space than she needed. When he left the room, she exhaled shakily, realizing how much she had missed not just his presence, but the sense of safety it had offered her. Later that week, as she walked down the long corridor toward the elevators, she overheard two colleagues talking. Not about her, not about Lucas, not about the meeting. Something unrelated entirely. And that was when she understood. The storm had passed for everyone except her. She was the only one still living inside it. The next morning, she arrived even earlier than before. She settled into her chair with the familiar hum of the computers around her, the empty office echoing its usual calm. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to inhale deeply, closing her eyes as if letting the silence swallow her whole. But then footsteps approached. Lucas. He greeted her with a quiet "good morning" and placed a document on her desk. He didn't linger. He didn't try to initiate conversation. He simply offered the same respect and steadiness he always had. Yet something about his presence felt different that morning. Not heavy, not invasive, but grounding. Like an invitation she wasn't ready to accept, but could no longer ignore. As the day unfolded, Helena observed him from a distance. His composure remained intact, but his movements carried a subtle restraint, as if he was navigating the office with the awareness that her silence was both protection and injury. She realized then that her withdrawal had created an invisible boundary around him too, a boundary he politely honored but quietly endured. By late afternoon, as she walked toward the copy room, she found Lucas already there, organizing a set of printed binders. Their eyes met for the briefest moment. He didn't smile, but something in his expression softened. "Everything's under control," he said gently, stepping aside so she could pass. "Thank you," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. The moment was small, almost insignificant in the eyes of anyone else. But for her, it felt like the first crack in the wall she had built, a reminder that silence might shield her, but it also suffocated her slowly. And as she returned to her desk, she finally admitted to herself what she had been trying to ignore. Distance may protect, but it also wounds. The turning point arrived quietly, without warning or drama. It happened on a Thursday morning, in the stillness before the office filled with footsteps. Helena sat at her desk, the screen's glow soft against her face, when a reflection on the dark monitor startled her. Not the faint reflection of her features, but the sudden realization of how long she had been living inside the narrative others built for her. She leaned closer, studying the woman in the glass, the careful posture, the lines that held stories instead of age, the eyes that carried exhaustion mixed with something deeper, something she could almost recognize but had buried under decades of responsibility. She saw not the version of herself that the office reflected, background, reliable, replaceable, but the one she had forgotten to honor, a woman who had endured, adapted, and continued despite repeated erasures. She thought of her early years in the company, when she had arrived with a spark that had not yet been dimmed. She remembered speaking boldly in meetings, drafting reports with pride, believing she could shape the environment around her. But those years had taught her different lessons. Loyalty did not guarantee recognition, competence did not ensure visibility, and kindness, if misinterpreted, could bind her to roles she never chose. As she stared at her reflection, she realized how easily she had accepted dismissal as normal, how often she had allowed others to define her worth through silence, and how, over time, she had stopped expecting fairness. But Lucas had disrupted that pattern. His voice, steady and unwavering in that meeting room, had not only defended her work, it had forced her to confront what she had allowed herself to believe. His gesture had not created a scandal. It had revealed a truth she had been too cautious to acknowledge, that she had value long before anyone recognized it. She closed her eyes and let memories surface, moments she had dismissed as inconsequential, but now understood differently. Lucas adjusting a spreadsheet to align with her structure without being asked. The way he listened when she explained something, not out of obligation but genuine respect. His quiet presence during late-night work sessions, steady like a heartbeat beside her. None of these moments were grand, yet each one carried weight. The rumor storm had twisted those moments into something else entirely. But the original truth still existed beneath the distortion, a human connection built on admiration and trust, untainted before others imposed their versions onto it. As the day progressed and the office filled, Helena felt a shift within herself. Not loud, not defiant, but steady. She observed the colleagues who had once whispered about her, now absorbed in new topics. Their judgments had moved on, leaving only faint traces. But she no longer felt defined by their evaluations. Instead, she recognized how small their voices seemed when compared to the truth she carried within. During a mid-morning meeting, she spoke with more steadiness than she had in weeks. Her points were clear, her tone calm, her presence unmistakably grounded. For the first time in a long time, she did not shrink under the weight of possible interpretations. She simply existed fully. Lucas noticed. His gaze held a quiet warmth when she contributed, as if relieved to see her reclaim space she had abandoned. He refrained from interrupting or reinforcing her comments, not out of distance, but respect. He allowed her voice to stand on its own, strong and unshaken. Later, in the corridor, their paths crossed briefly. He stepped aside to let her pass, offering a nod that carried more meaning than a phrase. She felt an answer rise within her, an acknowledgement she had been too guarded to offer before, and nodded back, her expression softer than in previous days. As she continued walking, she realized how much of her fear had been shaped by the idea of being misinterpreted. not by her own truth. The comments, the stares, the assumptions, they were echoes, empty echoes. But her own voice, long muted, had begun to return with clarity. By afternoon, she found herself in the storage room again, sorting through old binders. But instead of hiding, she was searching. She ran her fingers along the labeled spines. Projects completed, challenges overcome, data sets she had rescued from collapse. Each binder was proof of her endurance, her contributions, her quiet brilliance. She wasn't invisible. She had merely allowed others to dim her light. As she returned to her desk, she caught another reflection in a glass panel. Hers, but different now. Shoulders less tight, expression more centered. Something inside her had shifted, aligning her inner world with the truth she had avoided confronting. She had always been enough. Her worth had never depended on acknowledgement, but acknowledging herself mattered more than she had permitted. And Lucas, whether intentionally or not, had held up a mirror she had needed for years. As evening approached, she walked past him on her way out. He glanced at her, offering a small but genuine smile. This time, she didn't look away. She allowed that warmth to reach her, allowed herself to return it. It wasn't acceptance of anything beyond the present. It wasn't a declaration or a promise. It was simply this: recognition. A recognition that she could finally bear without fear. The shift between Helena and Lucas unfolded slowly over the next days. Subtle gestures, quiet acknowledgments, small exchanges that carried more meaning than the office could ever comprehend. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no conversation that defined their connection. Instead, their bond returned in a way that felt organic, grounded, and unmistakably different from before. Helena approached each morning with a steadier heart. She no longer rushed into the building to avoid seeing others. She didn't hide in storage rooms or corridors. She moved through the space with a sense of reclaimed identity, her posture more assured, her voice more certain. And as she regained herself, Lucas naturally drifted closer, not in physical proximity, but in presence. Their first true moment of reconnection happened near the printer. Papers jammed, forming a messy stack of duplicates. Helena reached to fix it at the same time Lucas arrived with his documents. Their hands brushed, and instead of pulling away abruptly as she might have before, she simply paused. He froze too, not startled, not embarrassed, just aware. The air felt suspended, holding a recognition that neither needed to articulate. She cleared the jam and handed him his papers. "Here," she said softly. "Thank you," he replied, his tone gentle, appreciative. It was a moment so brief it could have been overlooked. But for Helena, it felt significant, the first sign that the distance she had built was no longer necessary. Throughout the week, small interactions continued to weave themselves naturally back into their routine. A shared glance during a complicated meeting, a quiet exchange about a missing data file, a soft chuckle when they stumbled upon an error buried deep in the spreadsheets. These weren't dramatic moments, yet each one restored the ease they once had, now deepened by everything they had endured. But something had changed. Their connection was no longer accidental. It carried intention, not romantic, not inappropriate, but human, genuine, steady. One afternoon, while finalizing documents for the project's next phase, Helena found Lucas at her desk, reviewing a section she had completed. He looked up when she approached, his expression warm but unobtrusive. "You solved the projection issue," he said. "I was stuck on that." "You would have figured it out," she replied. "Not the way you did." The compliment was simple, but it touched her differently now. It didn't ignite embarrassment or fear. It settled gently in her chest, grounding her. As the day progressed, they continued working side by side, offering insights and quiet encouragement. The office buzzed around them, but the noise no longer drowned her confidence. Instead, Helena felt anchored, both in her own worth and in the unspoken understanding between them. Near the end of the day, a minor crisis hit the team, missing metrics needed for an executive report. Panic spread quickly as managers scrambled to assign blame. Helena stepped forward with calm authority, coordinating the search, delegating tasks, and reconstructing the lost data with efficiency honed by years of experience. Lucas worked beside her, mirroring her steadiness, following her lead without question. Their collaboration felt seamless, as if the earlier storm had strengthened the invisible thread between them. After the crisis passed and the office slowly emptied, Helena gathered her things. Lucas approached her as she prepared to leave. He didn't hover or intrude. He simply stood nearby, allowing her to choose whether a moment existed between them. "You handled that incredibly well," he said. "It's part of the job," she answered. Not everyone could have stayed that calm. She hesitated, then looked up at him. For the first time, she allowed herself to meet his gaze fully, not with caution or self-consciousness, but with quiet acceptance. In his eyes, she saw not admiration distorted by others, but recognition of her competence, her resilience, her worth. "Thank you," she said, her tone sincere. He nodded, offering a small, almost imperceptible smile. As she walked into the hallway, she realized something had shifted. Not in the office, not in Lucas, but within herself. Work was still work, with its routines and pressures and politics. But the world inside those walls had changed. The once suffocating environment now felt larger, less confining. Not because the office had transformed, but because she had. She no longer saw herself as the woman people whispered about, nor as the invisible worker behind countless successes. She saw herself as someone capable of connection, someone deserving of respect, someone whose presence mattered. And Lucas, without trying to reshape her life, without asking for anything, had become a quiet reminder of the truth she had reclaimed. When she stepped outside and felt the evening air brush against her skin, Helena understood that something rare had begun to take root. Not a romance, not an expectation, but a connection that had begun in work hours and routines, yet now lived somewhere deeper, a space where she no longer felt alone, and where being seen no longer felt like a threat, but a possibility. The storm of whispers faded long before Helena realized it. People found fresher topics to dissect, new dramas to inflate, newer tensions to circulate. Offices thrived on novelty, and her story, once the centerpiece of speculation, had become old material in the relentless churn of workplace curiosity. The glances diminished, the hushed tones softened, and eventually, life resumed its normal rhythm. But something inside her resisted settling back into the shape she had occupied before all of it happened. One morning, as she walked into the building, she noticed the way sunlight filtered through the glass entryway, painting lines of brightness across the floor. She paused, letting the moment sink in. For years, she had rushed through that space, unseen even by herself. But now she moved with a new kind of awareness, of her presence, her history, her place in the world. Something had shifted so deeply that she could no longer pretend to be invisible. Work unfolded with its usual demands. Reports were due, meetings clogged the calendar, and deadlines pressed without mercy. Yet Helena carried herself differently. She spoke with a steadiness that surprised even her, contributed to discussions with clarity, and refused to shrink when others tried to overshadow her. A quiet confidence guided her movements. Not loud or assertive, but grounded, like a well-rooted tree that no longer feared the wind. Lucas noticed the change. He didn't comment on it, didn't try to label it. He simply recognized it in the subtle ways he interacted with her, stepping back so her voice could lead, offering his thoughts without overshadowing hers, listening with even more attentiveness than before. Their connection no longer depended on shared struggle. It grew now from something deeper. Mutual respect, mutual steadiness, mutual becoming. They didn't talk about the rumors that had once surrounded them. There was no need. The silence between them held understanding, shaped not by avoidance, but by acceptance of everything that had passed. The tension that once made the office feel like a battlefield had dissolved. In its place was something calmer, richer, more honest. One afternoon, Helena was asked to present a portion of the project in front of a group of directors. Normally, she would have prepared in silence, quietly carrying the weight of responsibility. But this time, Lucas approached her desk as she reviewed her slides. "If you want a second set of eyes," he said gently, "I can help." She hesitated, not out of fear, but out of the unfamiliar comfort of being offered support. After a brief pause, she nodded. "Yes, I'd like that." They reviewed the presentation together in a small conference room. Lucas offered suggestions with care, focusing on clarity rather than style, letting her lead the direction without interruption. When she spoke, he listened fully. When she paused, he gave her space to think. When she doubted a point, he reminded her, simply, quietly, that her knowledge was solid. The next day, Helena delivered the presentation with a confidence she hadn't felt in years. Her voice was steady, her explanations clear, her answers direct. There was no tremble, no shrinking, no apology woven into her tone. She stood firmly in the center of the room and owned her space. When the directors nodded in approval, she felt not pride in their recognition, but pride in herself. After the meeting, as she walked back to her desk, Lucas caught her eye and offered a quiet nod that said everything words couldn't. "You did that. You." The acknowledgement warmed her more deeply than she expected. Weeks passed. The project neared completion, leaving behind a trail of long nights, breakthroughs, and the quiet transformation of two people who had navigated chaos together. Helena noticed how her colleagues now approached her with more respect, not out of fear or obligation, but because she carried herself differently. She no longer allowed herself to fade into the background. She stepped into spaces she once avoided. She spoke without shrinking. One evening, after most of the office had cleared out, Helena and Lucas stood near the window overlooking the city. The room was dim, illuminated only by the glow of monitors and the fading light outside. "You've changed," Lucas said softly, not as an observation, but as a gentle truth. Helena didn't look away. "Maybe I've just stopped hiding." He nodded, his expression warm, steady. "You shouldn't have had to hide." For a moment, silence stretched between them, not heavy, not uncertain, but intimate in the most grounded way. The kind of silence shared by two people who understood each other without needing to label anything. Helena breathed softly, letting the moment settle. She realized then that the story the office had created about them no longer mattered. The rumors no longer held any power. What remained, what had survived the noise, was something undeniably real. Not romance, not obligation, not expectation, but a bond built from courage, respect, and the quiet recognition of two lives that had touched in a way neither had anticipated. When they finally locked up the office and walked toward the elevators, Helena felt the soft weight of transformation resting gently on her shoulders. She no longer carried the fear of being misunderstood. She no longer measured her worth through other people's voices. And as the elevator doors closed, she understood the final truth of everything she had lived. The comments had vanished, but what remained between her and Lucas, steady, quiet, and deeply human, no rumor could touch.